Okay, good. People are starting to sign in here. Some of my core group here and some new names that I haven't seen before. That's awesome. Hi, everybody. Can you give a quick wave or put your name in the chat or something? Just say hello. Okay, this is awesome. Got 18 so far. Give it about another minute and then we'll officially start. Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome back to the first community table for 2025. And we have some familiar faces to you, though they are with a new venue platform than in a previous life. Ryan and Khalil, who have provided trainings for us in the past, are back with their own organization now, Heartset, and so we're really excited to be supporters of that. And they've created some materials that are unique to us in Louisville and some of the things that we are experiencing here in our uh, culture and political climate. And so I'm not going to waste any more of their time. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan and Khalil and let them do their thing.
Thanks so much, Laura. Yeah, we're super excited to be back with this group, back with you. Want to just kind of give a really brief intro to who we are and what we're about. As mentioned, my name is Ryan. I use they and them pronouns, and I'm one of the founding trainers of Heartset Training Center. Have a background in providing housing first and harm reduction trainings in spaces all across the country, and including virtual formats like this. And my clinical or direct practice background is really in mental health and substance use co-occurring disorders care, as well as some other things along the line. But I've been in the training and education space for a little while now. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to talk with you about trauma-informed care. I'll kick it over to Khalil to introduce himself.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Khalil Martin. My pronouns are he, him, and his. I am a therapist by way of the social work profession. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Philadelphia. Uh, my work primarily focuses on working with Black and Brown folks, queer folks, and I'm hoping to soon like niche down into the trauma space, which is why I really appreciate trauma-informed care. That's me. Happy to be here and see you for really the next few months. It sounds like. Well, you'll be seeing our faces through May.
Yeah, we want to take just a minute to talk a little bit about this training series because we have a lot of trainings lined up that you're, of course, welcome to attend. So this first training series is all about trauma-informed care. It's called TIC-Talk, Untangling Trauma One Step at a Time. We're also going to dive into motivational interviewing next month in the month of March. We'll be doing some vicarious trauma later on in the series. And some other training. So in general, we're going to do 3 trainings a month on a given topic. So this month, the month of February, is all about trauma-informed care. And the pattern that we're going to follow is we're going to spend our first session kind of outlining the basics, the fundamentals of a given topic, wanting to make sure that we're all on the same page with our knowledge base. We'll spend the second session of each month, the second Wednesday of the month, on kind of the principles, the core principles and concrete practices that back those principles up. We want you to be able to walk away from the second session with some actual tools in your pocket that you could potentially use. And then we'll wrap up the fourth Wednesday of each month is going to really focus on practical application, right? So we're going to spend time doing breakout groups, doing some role playing, doing some application of the stuff we've been talking about for the previous 2 sessions. So we're really excited about the potential for interactivity and kind of really fleshing out each of these topics in some depth. So want to hit you with some shared expectations. From us, you can expect that we're going to engage you in dialogue, right? And so what we're expecting is that if you have something to contribute, shout it out. Put something in the chat, raise your hand, your little Zoom hand, and we'll see if we can get you unmuted. Use the Q&A feature. We want to be in dialogue with you. Wanting to hear what you have to say. We are going to ask questions that are not rhetorical throughout this training series. And so one of our expectations is that you try and answer those questions. We're going to, in a little bit, we're going to ask you about your definition of trauma. And I think it's important for us that we're not speaking into the void. So if you have something, an answer to that question that you're thinking of, put it out there for the rest of us to hear. We'll all learn better that way. Another expectation that we have is that probably not everybody's going to agree with everything that we say, or even agree with each other. And yet we still want to hear it, right? And so looking forward to engaging in a critical dialogue, even if we're not always in agreement, because I think that's going to support best care for the folks that we want to serve. We also expect, especially in that vein of disagreement and critical perspectives, that we're not going to have time to have a full discussion about every single concept. So there may be some times where we might have to move us along and draw a conversation to a close. It's not that we don't want to hear what you have to say. We're just trying to balance that dialogue piece with a full kind of didactic experience where we share all the things that we want to share from our slide deck. Finally, our final expectation is that if you complete our session evaluation, which we'll put a link to in the chat at the end of the session, you can expect to receive a copy of our slides and some supplemental materials. So just wanting to kind of hit you with that idea that there is going to be a session evaluation that we offer. The Coalition for the Homeless also has their own evaluation, and we hope you'll grace us with your input on both of those venues. All right. Today, part 1 of this TIC-Talk session, this trauma-informed care series. By the end of this session, 3 simple objectives. We want you to be able to define trauma and understand its impact on the brain. We also want you to be able to list the 5 R's of trauma-informed care. If you're familiar with trauma-informed care, maybe you're familiar with the 4 R's. So we'll hit you with a 5th R today, and we'll want you to be able to speak to those by the end of the session. We also want you to be able to explain the relationship between homelessness and trauma, which is complex and pretty core to the work that we do. In terms of our agenda, here's what we want to cover in this session. We want to talk very briefly about the history of trauma-informed care, where it came from, its roots, and some of its components. And as we do that, we're going to start to put the information into the 5 R's, right? We're going to talk to you about the 5 R's, and within those 5 R's, we're going to structure our presentation to present them through that lens, right? So the first R is realization, and so we'll spend time defining trauma and understanding its sources. Next, we'll understand people's responses to trauma, the various ways that people respond to trauma. We'll talk about responding from a provider perspective to that trauma and how we can provide services that avoid re-traumatizing people. And we'll take a brief look at what next session is going to look like and have some time for Q&A. All right, Khalil, hit us with what is TIC?
Awesome. So, excuse me, if you've ever been in any kind of if you are a social worker or a psychologist or studied trauma in any way, whether that was a training or in the education space, you might have actually heard this reframe already. But sometimes we might actually be asking our clients or the folks that we work with, what's wrong with you, right? Why did you do this thing or why can't you do this thing? And what we really want to encourage and emphasize in trauma-informed care is to kind of flip that on its head and really consider the whole person, right? What happened to this person? What happened to you that you would like make this decision or present in this way, right? So I think if you hear anything, this shift is probably pretty important, right? We are kind of reframing the idea of what's wrong with you to what happened to you. We're not asking clients quite literally, what happened to you, right? Maybe if that's appropriate, if we're doing like some biopsych and assessment stuff, but this is kind of the mindset we want to have when we're thinking about trauma-informed care. What happened? Um, so we're gonna move right along to talking a little bit about the history. And this was actually um, really fun for me to be doing and thinking about, and I hope to actually expand this a little bit more. But right now, we know that trauma-informed care has its roots in mental health and substance use settings. And the first folks to name this were Maxine Harris and Roger D. Fallon. And they named this because something that they saw was that in treatment settings, a lot of folks, men and women, were reporting childhood trauma or a lot of sexual assault as well, childhood sexual assault specifically, but were requesting support or seeking services for different psychiatric things, right? Substance use, some other mental health stuff. Um, and the way that they frame this or understand this is that our systems are serving survivors without treating them. So that's where kind of the idea of trauma-informed care. How can we engage with this person knowing their childhood trauma history, right? Trauma spans our lifetime, right? So it's not just childhood trauma, but that is kind of where this evolved from. So they emphasize three primary ideas, and that is universal screening and assessment, not causing re-traumatization, and promoting understanding biopsychosocial nature and effects of trauma, all of which we'll cover here. Some of that falls into some of the 5 Rs. Some of that is more brain stuff, and we'll talk about that as well. So it is formally written into some policies by SAMHSA, so our Substance Use and Mental Health Service Administration, and also the American Medical Association. And I think right now we're seeing a shift in healthcare, really emphasizing the importance of trauma-informed care, right? But you can see how recent it is, right? With AMA only putting this into writing in the past, like 4 or 5 years. Alrighty, so we're going to talk about some trauma-informed care definition stuff now. So, not nitty-gritty definitions, but we think like easily digestible kind of ways to understand what we mean when we're talking about trauma-informed care. So we like to view trauma-informed care as a framework for understanding and responding to the impact of trauma. It's not necessarily a specific program or a set of tools. It is mostly ideas and principles, which we'll talk about in our Trauma-Informed Care series. But it emphasizes safety. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about safety, we're talking about physical, psychological, and emotional safety. Sometimes in our organizations, safety is really centered around the idea of like physical safety, right? But doesn't necessarily take into concern the idea of psychological safety or emotional safety. So it just emphasizes safety in general in all three of these ways. It applies to clients, which we know, residents, participants in our programs, but also to staff, right? We talk about how the chances that anybody you come into contact with has experienced some form of trauma in their life is very high, very likely. So yes, that includes the people you support in the work that you do, but also your colleagues, your peers, and your friends as well. So the focus is deliver services that keep that in mind, right? That this person has some sort of trauma history. And as a helping person or helping professional, I don't want to be re-traumatizing this person if that is in my control. So there's also a recent shift that we'd like to share from trauma-informed care to trauma and violence-informed care, which I think has a lot of relevance right now, especially. Violence can be lumped into the idea of trauma, right? But I think when we talk about trauma and violence-informed care, we think about violence in its many forms, right? So not just person to person or violence that takes place in our community, but violence that folks might experience as a result of structural things, right? Politics, governance of some sort. Your agencies might be feeling this already fiscally or financially, and some of the recent political changes and climate here, right? So, and what that might look like to do, and maybe we should have included this in the respond section, right? But is including questions about structural barriers to that folks experience, right? When we're engaging with them for the first time, right? What is your experience in healthcare settings? How are you feeling in making follow-up appointments? Is there anything that's keeping you from those spaces, right? That's how we might also lump in the violence that folks experience at multiple levels. You're muted, Ryan.
Oops, sorry. Um, there are some kind of basic assumptions that we can think about if we say that we want to implement some of what Kalo has talked about so far, right? Like if we say that we would like to provide services from a trauma-informed lens, we think that there should be a basic set of assumptions that guide the work that we all do, right? Will our programs look exactly the same? Probably not. Some folks are focused on emergency housing. Some folks are focused on long-term and permanent supportive housing. And yet there are some basic assumptions we should be able to make about a trauma-informed program, or a program that responds to folks' ongoing structural acute trauma that they've experienced, right? So here's those assumptions, and maybe this is a familiar quote to you, but it's where we get this idea of the 4, and then we'll talk about the 5 R's that we're going to focus and structure the rest of this training around. So a trauma-informed care-based program is one that realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential pathways for recovery. It also recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved in the system. It responds by fully integrating knowledge that we have about trauma into our policies, into our procedures, into our direct practices, and seeks to actively resist traumatization, right? So it's not going to matter if you have such a fancy and evidence-based way of responding to trauma if every time you implement that intervention, it also re-traumatizes somebody, right? And so really wanting to kind of highlight this resisting of re-traumatization as maybe the core of what we're talking about. Khalil has mentioned already that structural factors can be included in our understanding of violence. And one structural factor that people experience is the literal system that we have to support them, right? Many people experience quite a bit of trauma simply seeking services in our system, right? And so this resist re-traumatization is a key here. And then finally, and this one is not part of this quote. If you go look up SAMHSA's documentation about trauma-informed care, you won't see this one, but we think it's really important to include, which is that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to do things that are triggering to people. We're going to do things that are maybe insensitive to the experiences that people have had so far and are not best supportive of them in terms of the trauma exposure that they've had. And yet, we have to still do the work. We're still here doing the work. So if we're going to make those mistakes, we need to take it upon ourselves to be humble enough and assess ourselves well enough and critically reflect on our own work well enough to be able to acknowledge those mistakes and to repair, right? So we often talk about the accountability that's necessary for our clients, and there is a level of accountability that is required to provide care to somebody who's experienced trauma, right? And so that repair is so crucial, and we'll talk more about the ways that that intersects with general power dynamics as helpers that we have. So we wanted to outline those 5 R's so far because that is the way that we're going to structure the remainder of this presentation, right? We're going to try and model the 5 R's through how we present the material. So the first R is realization. So I'll just put all this on the screen here. And it's that all people of all levels of the organization or the system have an understanding of how trauma can affect the people that we serve, right? And I really do just want to kind of uplift this idea that trauma-informed care is not simply a realization on the part of the case manager serving somebody in housing or in shelter or on the streets. Trauma-informed care also includes middle managers, supervisors, executives, board members. All people at all levels must have an understanding of the way trauma plays a role in this whole world that we're living in, right? And then further, this realization includes the idea that if people are doing things, the way that people act, the way people show up in services has so much to do with the trauma that they've experienced, right? And so we can understand the behavior that we're seeing in our work, sometimes combative behavior, for example, sometimes really withdrawn and antisocial type of behavior, right? We could look at that and say, oh, this person has so much growing to do, right? We need to figure out how to set a treatment goal of them not being combative. Well, to me, that's not really buying into this idea of realization. With realization, we can understand that the behavior we're seeing is communicative of their survival-based coping strategies that they've had, right? They've developed a set of coping strategies to manage the trauma they've experienced. And the behavior you're seeing in your program is simply the kind of overflow of that, right? They're taking survival-based coping skills and applying them to situations that maybe they don't even need to anymore. And so there's this relearning that has to take place about how to respond and manage reaction. And then I also wanted to say that, of course, trauma plays a role in mental health and substance use. Two key factors in homelessness, by the way, right? And two key factors in the experience of becoming homeless, the experience of living unsheltered, etc. Right? And so there's this mutually reinforcing cycle that happens where a person experiences a trauma, and then, as Kahlo mentioned, that people will go and seek support for some other thing, right? I'm seeking support for my substance use. And so we're treating people for substance use or mental health, and not always treating their underlying trauma, where it came from. And then, of course, the experience of substance use, the experience of mental health challenges can lead to other and different traumas, right? So this cycle that perpetuates. In terms of realizing the widespread impact of trauma, we want to give you just a couple of ideas here. In terms of traumatic exposure, some studies estimate over 80% of people in the United States have experienced at least one type of traumatic event. 80% of people in the entire United States, not talking about just people in receiving housing supports or services, right? So if 80% of us have experienced some type of traumatic event that has had an adverse impact on our lives, imagine what the stats must be for people who have experienced homelessness, right? So I want to kind of offer 3 layers of trauma that people experience when they are interacting with our system. Number one, there is going to be the trauma that leads to homelessness, right? So maybe somebody lost supports. Maybe they needed supports to be able to remain housed, and they lost that for whatever reason. Perhaps they lost their employment. And of course, I'm sure many of you have had the experience of talking with somebody who has some wild job in the past, right? I was a nuclear physicist. Well, what are you doing on the street now? Well, I got laid off, and then I was never able to get another job again, and then my mental health got worse, and then I started using drugs, right? And so we see this cycle play out. There is a level of trauma that has led to somebody becoming homeless, right? Maybe even the loss of a physical home. We hear so much right now about the fires that are happening in LA. A very common story. Somebody loses their home and have a really tough time getting back on their feet. So that's the first layer of trauma for folks that we're serving, the trauma that led them to the experience of homelessness. The second layer is the trauma of actually becoming homeless, right? Like all of the stuff that happens in the process of somebody becoming homeless, right? So somebody's becoming evicted for the first time or for the 10th time. That is a level of trauma there, right? When people reach the financial boiling point where they can no longer pay or afford to pay their bills or their rent or whatever, that level of trauma, that snap that can happen is what I'm talking about here. That decision, okay, I don't have anywhere to go, I'm going to sleep in my car tonight. There's a trauma baked into that experience, right? And then the third layer that I wanted to kind of point you to is the trauma that occurs once somebody has become unhoused, right? The trauma around answering the question, where am I going to sleep tonight? How am I going to cope? One example that I often like to give is people using uppers, amphetamines, or of some kind to stay awake long into the night when they're sleeping on the street so that they don't get jumped or assaulted, right? all of that is baked into a level of trauma. And then if I'm sleeping somewhere that's unsafe, my level of danger and risk is increased, right? So many people experience trauma. If you're a person who is unhoused, the chances that you have experienced a traumatic event in your life are probably closer to 100% than any other number.
Awesome. I don't know how I got stuck with all the definition stuff, but I promise more fun in real life. Um, no, but I think we are going to talk, hopefully get some engagement here in the chat. But from what you've heard about trauma-informed care so far, um, I'm curious about one way you might be practicing trauma-informed care now in the work that you do provide for the folks that you work with. If you can go ahead and shoot that in the chat, I think that'd be really helpful. How are we doing trauma-informed care right now? And if that's difficult to think about, if you're like, I don't know yet, and we've still got some more trainings to get through, maybe just this word, right? What is a trauma? How do you define trauma? Or does your agency have a definition that you like to go with? If it's easier to talk about trauma than trauma-informed care, that's why we're here, right? So if this is an easier definition, oh, here we go. Nick says we begin by listening and asking questions to gain better understanding of the person's story. Yeah, a lot of like trauma-specific therapy modalities really emphasize like the client's narrative, right? When their power was taken away or they didn't feel in control, they have probably never told their story or their experience of that, right? So I think that listening piece is probably really important. Um, a trauma-informed care committee sounds really awesome, really helpful, and I think holds our feet to the fire when those are taking place like within an agency. Um, we try to meet people where they are and build trust, build a healing relationship. So good things. Trust is probably really important if you are asking somebody to be vulnerable with you. Language access, yes, absolutely. A very tangible and actionable thing we might be able to be providing or troubleshooting for folks, especially when it comes to trauma. We talked about safety um, in multiple ways, like our um, our physical safety, our psychological safety, and our emotional safety, right? When we're in pain, whether that's physical pain or emotional pain, we want to be communicating in a language that is our native language, right? So I think that is very important as well. Um, we approach people with a person first mindset. I'm considering this person and they're bringing to this table, maybe over the documentation that we need to get done or complete during this time, right? If somebody's hungry, that's an example I love to give. How irritable are you when you're hungry, right? I'm pretty irritable if I haven't eaten all day. Ryan's pretty irritable when they're thirsty, right? And we might not be our best selves or able to engage in any sort of like healthy or effective communication or work during that time. EMDR training for therapists. Um, we meet them where they are. Yeah, absolutely. Specific like trauma modalities and interventions are probably are hopefully very trauma informed, right? This is all good stuff. I appreciate these comments in the chat. Um, we can move the slides forward, Ryan. All righty. So this is a definition that I think we really appreciate. But this one says that individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by the individual as physically or emotionally harmful, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, I'm sorry, and really their overall well-being, right? And I think one of the most important E's here, they're probably all really important, but I think the experience piece is important to know because not everyone's going to experience the same event as traumatic or as a trauma. For example, if Ryan and I are in a car together and we get in a car accident, we're not going to experience that accident in the same way, right? Maybe I'm feeling really shaken up and traumatized by this, and those symptoms last a really long time. And maybe Ryan comes out of that really unscathed, right? Um, it doesn't mean that my trauma isn't a trauma, right? It just means my experience of this felt a little different, right? And somebody's own like personal scaffolding, right? Their like social circumstances and what they're like composed of or made of, and we'll talk a little bit about brain development soon as well, probably is what's informing that. Ryan's ability to walk away from this car accident and be mostly okay or move through that on their own, or my ability to not do that, right? To kind of be stuck in that place, maybe is what that might look like. But the three E's, I think, are really helpful in understanding a traumatic experience specifically. All right, now we're going to move on to some fun brain stuff. We're going to talk about trauma and the brain in this is a very quick and dirty kind of run through of our brain on trauma, right? If you've ever been to like a dare like presentations like your brain on drugs, right? Or your brain on meth or your brain on heroin. But we're gonna talk about your brain on trauma, because that's probably happening before your brain is on drugs, like meth or heroin. But anyway, I think an important piece to know is that our brain develops um, in a way that is like very, really kind of simple to understand, right? So we have the beginning of our brain in the brain stem, if you see it over here, kind of at the base of our heads, our brains, and our neck, right? That's going to be one of the first things that develops in our brain. And it controls our survival instincts, right? We'll talk a little bit more later about some specific fear responses, or some people may call them trauma responses, right? Our fight, flight, or freeze. These are survival instincts. They keep us alive. They're not bad. Flight, fight, or freeze is not bad. They're what keep us alive initially, right? It's what it's meant to do. Um, and then we have our limbic system right there in the middle, right? So this part of our brain is full of many, many parts, but processes emotions and creates memories. That's where we hold those. And then we have, I like to call our big brain, right? Enables abstract thinking, moral reasoning, and self-regulation. This mostly takes place in our frontal cortex, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we're talking about the trauma space. But hopefully these visuals are helpful, right? Our brainstem is kind of our our survival system, right? There's a fire there to represent that. If anyone is competition reality fan, I am. Survivor premieres on February 26th. Our limbic system controls our emotions, and then our cerebral cortex, right, gives us the green light. It is telling us to go or not go, based on what these other parts of our brains are doing. And just again, really quickly, the order of operations here are going to be our brainstem senses danger, right? Which triggers our amygdala, which is very, very close to our limbic system. Um, so then our emotional brain makes a decision based on what's going on with the amygdala, right? And then our cerebral cortex, mostly in our frontal lobe, tells us what we're going to do as a result of that information. Are we going to fight? Are we going to flop? We'll talk about that as well. But I think another important piece to know is that when we're talking about brain development, we're not talking about like when you are a baby and a baby only, right? We know that for many of us, our brains are developing for at least a whole quarter of our lives. Um, and I think that's important to know. Our amygdala, however, which is informing what our emotional brain or how our emotional brain is retaining memories and information, is fully formed at 6 months. And I think that's a fun like tidbit of information to know. While our brain is in development for quite some time, our amygdala is fully formed at 6 months old, right? So our earliest experience do impact some other little things going on, well, major things that are happening on a very micro level, right? Like gene activation and brain growth. These can be really positive things, like our experience with our caregivers. And they can also be like some pretty adverse things. We talk about childhood trauma, what some of those things are. And sometimes when our brain is still developing and we experience these things at such a young age, this is what we start to call developmental trauma, right? An additional trauma definition. We'll give another definition for that as well. But severe disruptions during our brain development can lead to long-term effects, what we might call trauma, right? So these disruptions might be the actual trauma. Oh, this thing happened to you, your brain changed in this way. Basically, trauma can have just a real life impact on your brain and its formation, right? A very like physiological kind of response to the things that have happened to you or the things that you've experienced in your life that feel out of control and really scary. Some additional trauma definitions, because trauma is big and expansive, right? We have complex trauma that many folks are probably familiar with. It was first introduced in the 90s and typically refers to multiple traumatic experiences over a long period of time. Sometimes it is difficult to give so complex trauma is not currently in the DSM, right? It's recognized by the ICD, but it is not in our DSM right now. A lot of the folks we encounter and work with, I think in homelessness or substance use settings, have quite a bit of complex trauma, right? They may not be able to pinpoint one specific event that has happened to them that changed their lives forever, but it might be multiple. Ryan talked about the traumatic experience that might, the layer that might involve just like that experience of experience that experience of experiencing homelessness sounds weird, but that experience of being homeless, right? Sleeping in your car. What are you exposed to as a result of doing this for weeks, for months, for years? So that's an example of what complex trauma can look like. Food insecurity, I think, is another good example. Living in poverty generally is probably a good example. Relationship with parents and how we're raised is also a pretty common example of complex trauma. We talked about developmental trauma. It's exactly what it sounds like. Those disruptions that happen in the earliest stages of our brain's development that alter the structure and the makeup of our brain. Then we have vicarious and secondary trauma, which we're not going to talk about a ton in this specific training because we're going to have an entire training on this as well. But this is going to be the trauma that's experienced as a result of your work, right? And I think what that looks like right now isn't like super important to name or share. But vicarious trauma and secondary trauma are happening in the work that we do. And we also make a case that you should be feeling something, right, in this work. So, and when you're not, that might be a symptom of vicarious trauma. If you are feeling traumatized and experiencing similar symptoms as like an event that maybe sorry, I need to take a breath and slow down. You experiencing an event or a memory of like a story a client told you as if it is happening to you might represent secondary trauma. And then historical and intergenerational trauma, right? This is the trauma that we might not always be able to name, but maybe you are part of communities that have really adverse experiences in healthcare settings, right? And I encourage you to think about what were you socialized to think and believe about healthcare settings? Were they safe? Were there certain things you could or could not say? I'm reading a really cool book right now called Cry Baby, Why Our Tears Matter. And one of the things that they talk a lot about vulnerability and like crying specifically, but I think this is something I think about from through like a historic lens too. What have you been taught about vulnerability or tears or crying? When can you do it? When should you not? Right? And what is that informed by? Your parents, their parents, or other spaces that you're in? Are there kind of like gender norms here? But yeah, we see this a lot. Groups of people being harmed collectively. And we hold that in our bodies, in our brains, and then we make more children, right? And pass things on that way as well. So it's not only storytelling, but also, again, a physiological experience for folks.
All right, this is our final slide in this like realization section, right? We're talking through the 5 R's and we're still in realization. And maybe this is a familiar concept to you, the ACE study. But I wanted to just kind of shout it out real quick because it was a seminal bit of work that happened that led to our understanding of the ways that trauma has these long-term impacts on our lives, well past the event themselves. And especially when we think about the developmental trauma that Kala was talking about, so much trauma is experienced in early childhood that has really significant and long-lasting effects on the lives of the people that we serve, as well as all the rest of us, right? So the ACE study was this longitudinal study that started in 1998. And the reason it gets so much hype is because of how many people participated in it. And when you have that many people participating in it, the results end up shedding quite a bit of light on people's experiences, right? So there were over 17,000 people that participated in this study. And they asked questions about what people had experienced in early childhood. And in particular, there were these 10 measures that they asked about. And you can see the 10 on the screen here. Did your family experience homelessness? Was there somebody in the family who was incarcerated while you were in early childhood? Was there somebody in the family with mental illness? Was there a divorce in the family? Was there physical or emotional neglect? Was mom depressed? Was there emotional and sexual abuse? Was there substance use in the family? Was there any interpersonal violence? So these were the kind of initial questions that they asked about. And if you had experienced any one of those things, that's like 1 point on the scale, right? And what they found, kind of diving into the deep end of this, is that compared with people who had not experienced any of these early adverse childhood experiences, people who had experienced 4 or more had massively increased risks. I'll give you a couple of stats here. So people who had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences were 390% more likely to have COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, right? People were 240% greater risk for having an STI at any point. People were twice as likely to be smokers as people with no ACEs. People were 12 times more likely, if you had 4 or more ACEs, to have suicidal behavior, right? Like make a suicide attempt. You were 7 times more likely to be able to be diagnosable with alcoholism and 10 times more likely to inject street drugs. So these things that happen to us in our early childhood, and Carlo talked about the way that our amygdala and our brain are impacted by early trauma, had these long-lasting health consequences for us, much less the mental health consequences, right? There are some analyses that have revealed that high prevalences of each of these ACEs were noted for people experiencing lifetime homelessness. And at any point, people who have experienced homelessness, the likelihood that they had one of these things was quite high, up to 60%. So that's ACEs. And I want to kind of there is a question in the chat that is a perfect lead into the next thing that I want to say. Becky's asking the question, is the idea or philosophy still held that environmental or community trauma is potentially an ACE score? So initially when the ACE study was coming out, that wasn't really a thought, right? They just wanted to know like what was directly happening to people in their early childhood and how did it impact them later on in life, right? So they followed people over time. But as the years progressed and as we've done more kind of replication studies and as we've sort of explored the human experience, there is a need really to illustrate the relationship between the adversity that's happening within a family and the adversity that's happening at the community level or the structural stuff, that stuff that you're talking about, Becky. And so the second half of this image that you see is adverse community environments, right? And it's things like poverty, discrimination, community disruption, lack of opportunity, poor housing quality and affordability, and of course, violence. And here they mean like physical violence. So the answer is yes, Becky. It is still held that those should be considered ACE scores. And some versions of the ACE study that are done now, or like replication studies or data collection, does ask about community level stuff or structural things, right? I do want to point out that to me, when I look at those like bottom level stuff, the adverse community environments, I can't but see a depiction of the role of structural racism in our society and the experience of trauma, right? And that's borne out by some of the stats, right? So Black children are more likely to have higher ACE scores compared to white children. And of course, that makes sense because when you think about parental incarceration, for example, well, that's rooted in anti-Blackness, right? And so all of these things are pretty well tied into structural racism. In addition, I think we could make the case that the experience of racism itself is a trauma that should be accounted for in these kind of early adverse childhood experiences or adverse community environments. And once again, I think we would see that borne out in the statistics. We sometimes do a racial disparities training, and it's my favorite thing to do to pull the data for whatever locality I'm presenting in at that time. And invariably, what we'll find is that homelessness is disproportionately affecting Black individuals in any given community across the United States. Right? So I think that further illustrates some of what we're talking about here. Let me take a breath and say this one last piece that maybe we should have spent more time talking about. We're talking about trauma. I want to mention something that is kind of the flip of trauma, which is resilience, right? And resilience is this concept that it speaks to people's capability to cope successfully in the face of significant change or adversity or a risk, right? So that capacity to cope is going to change over time and is going to be enhanced by protective factors in our environment or for us as individuals, right? So I just wanted to kind of call that out as Kala was giving the example of maybe he and I in a car accident, one of us experiences it as trauma and one does not. Part of that is going to be about the story of our own resilience or the protective factors that we have, right? If Kala has a much more supportive system around him to help him cope, he's going to experience a higher level of resilience and may not experience that event as quite as traumatic as somebody that doesn't. I just wanted to call that out. And I think we're ready to move on to this concept of recognition. So the first R was realization. The second R is recognition, being able to recognize trauma for what it is, or like the symptoms and responses that we see in people, being able to kind of draw a line between what I'm seeing and the trauma that I presume must have occurred, right? So recognition asks us to recognize how individual participants and staff may be expressing signs and symptoms of trauma. And I'm glad Khalil already spoke a little bit to vicarious trauma, because not only do we need to be alert for signs and symptoms of trauma in the folks that we serve, we need to be alert to it in our colleagues and peers, right? So it's fun for us to kind of think about the ways that the statements that we make are so ingrained in our head about how helping professions work, right? Well, I can't do more work than my client. And it's fun to think about, is that really indicative of burnout or vicarious trauma? And being able to call attention to that in a compassionate way with our colleagues is part of this recognition piece. Some tools that we have to be able to recognize trauma are screening and assessment practices, of course. And trauma-informed care is going to ask that is going to suggest that we're doing universal screening for people. I already mentioned that the likelihood of the experience of trauma in people who are unhoused or have been unhoused is probably close to 100%. Well, we need to implement some universal screening to sort of like flesh that out in our own programs. Another tool that we have is going to be setting-specific training. Trauma is going to present differently in different settings, right? I think it will present differently, or the signs of it will look different in an emergency shelter than they will be when somebody is housed in their own apartment, right? So maybe what it looks like to recognize trauma is noticing that somebody who just got their own apartment for the first time in many years is still sleeping on the floor of their apartment. But that's going to be a very different type of response to trauma than the person who is maybe in emergency shelter for the first time and they're feeling quite scared and they're unwilling to talk to anybody and they're keeping to themselves. Or maybe they hold a weapon on them and they keep getting kicked out of shelter for these reasons, right? Very different looks because of the setting that we're in. And so making sure that we're really clued into our specific setting and aware of the types of responses we might see there. And then, of course, another major tool is going to be our supervision, right? For a chance to be able to discuss cases with a compassionate supervisor who can see trauma for what it is, both in the person that we're serving, right? Like as a third party perspective, but also in the staff member and how they're experiencing um, supporting people and potential signs and symptoms there, right? Um, we let me see, what else do I want to say? I have like so many notes here, so many notes and so little time. Um, yeah, I think that's all I want to say here. Cullen, do you have anything to add to this recognition slide before I move on? Nope. Okay. All right. Well, let me pass it over to you to talk about trauma responses then.
Yeah, I do think that the idea of recognizing a trauma response is a pretty good kind of like segue to this idea. But we also, one of the things we might be looking at in like the recognition piece is like our own kind of response. We need to recognize the ways that we are like talking about clients, responding to clients, um, participants, residents, whatever the language we use is. And I appreciate this this slide, and I think it gives us some really helpful like alternatives for language. But if you've ever said something either directly to a participant or to like a colleague or coworker, like, oh, they're taking the low road, right? That's not the most trauma-informed care statement. It's not the worst thing you could say. I will admit I've probably said some things that sound worse than that, right? Oh, my client's taking the low road, right? But there actually might be some factual stuff in there, right? So when trauma hijacks our brain, when really terrible things happen or we're feeling triggered because of a trauma history, our brain really does prioritize the low road over the high road. So what we mean by that is it prioritizes our amygdala, right? Our fear response, what we are interpreting about that fear or that threat level, right? Um, which results in emotional reactivity, poor impulse control, and really overall challenge of like cognitive functioning. If you've ever seen somebody have a panic attack and their body might literally level itself, they might faint, right, or pass out, is what this might look like. So and what we mean by the low road being prioritized is like their brain is actually doing that. Their brain is saying, my brainstem and my amygdala need to be responding to this, right? And I might not have the ability to integrate the use of my frontal cortex, what is going to help me make decisions that might feel a little healthier, right? Um, can we go to the next slide, Ryan? So here's that brain visual again, just to show you what it looks like to prioritize the low road, right? So our brain stem and amygdala are down here at the bottom. And the high road, right, what might help us to make more healthy and effective decision is actually physically placed above that, right? So when you're saying, oh, my client took the low road, or my client is taking the low road, that might actually speak to um, a trauma response, right? Or an inability to engage in their frontal cortex or their thinking brain, right? To make decisions that you might like them to be making, or even make decisions that they actually want to be making. So I think that that's just helpful to know when it comes to some of the language that we're using, right? Our clients are difficult, they're challenging, so are their life circumstances, right? Um, so reverting back to and only being able to function with the earliest parts of our brain might actually be what's happening. I don't know where I heard this. I heard this from a teacher, but I don't know which teacher where. I don't know if it was a friend or or in another training, but the way that they said they engage with their students when they're having like a meltdown or misbehaving, however like little ones do, is they ask them if they're thinking with their lizard brain. What they mean is like their primitive brain, their earliest brains, right? And I think that's a really cool way to be looping in some education and psychoed stuff with little ones around trauma-informed care.
All right. Want to offer you some additional tools for being able to identify trauma responses. And so maybe you're familiar with this concept of the three, excuse me, I almost said the three E's, fight or flight, right? Fight or flight is a pretty commonly understood framework. And these days, because we keep adding F's to the fight or flight, right? There's many different types of responses that people can have, and I'll put a list of them here: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and even flop. It's beginning to get a little bit unwieldy. We don't say, "Oh, did you learn about the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, flop reaction?" And so acute stress response is what we'll use instead. That's how we'll categorize this, or also known as the hyperarousal response. So we're probably all familiar with the fight response. In this kind of response, folks are going to want to confront danger directly, right? And maybe we have people in our own lives or people that we've worked with directly in our practice where once they get triggered or stressed, they're immediately coming for somebody's neck, right? In a metaphorical or maybe even literal way. They're like physically combative or they're quite verbally assertive. They may spend a lot of time like talking over others, finding ways to assert dominance, and probably they even feel a bit of a adrenaline rush during conflicts, right? They almost thrive in those kind of environments. I can think of a participant in a former work setting that it seemed like every single time they were in the office and it was time to go, there would be a conflict of some kind, right? And to me, I think that's indicative of a stress response that they were having. They were feeling triggered, even in probably a way that they're not able to identify and speak to, and they got into fight mode, right? There was always a conflict when it was time to close a session and move on to the next part of our day. We might also already be familiar with the flight response. And so this is really about escaping from threatening situations. So people with a flight response may be quite avoidant. Maybe in our own lives, we can find examples of this. Maybe we immerse ourselves in our work to escape some uncomfortable emotions. I can think of a student that I worked with recently who shared with me that they lost one of their parents, and they were able to directly tie that to their very strong work ethic that they have, right? They're constantly maybe too busy. And this might be an example of avoidance, right? That flight response. I can also think of, when I'm thinking about the homelessness service setting, maybe we've got clients who never answer their door when it's time for a home visit, or whenever you call them, whenever it's treatment planning time, or whenever it's time to meet with the case manager, they're never around. But then they'll pop up on their own, right? When it's not time to do those things. I think that's an avoidance response, and it's worth digging into, like what may be happening there. We also have the freeze response. So this is kind of like a physical or a mental shutdown in the face of danger. So folks might become immobile, unable to take action. It can sometimes show up as like procrastination or even feeling paralyzed in social situations. We might see interesting examples of this when maybe we do a home visit with a client and they're quite open and able to be comfortable in their own home. They're able to talk with us. But as soon as they come into the drop-in center, they really shut down and have a hard time being themselves, right? Or expressing or talking. So they're just like on edge constantly when they're in more social spaces, more group-oriented spaces. And that's that immobility or that paralysis that they may feel when they're not feeling safe. We also have the fawn response. And so this is, you'll see this when people kind of operate through the lens of appeasement, trying to appease other people. So we see this with like an excessive eagerness to please, to placate other people. I can think of many examples of this in my work, maybe in like treatment planning time. And I'm asking somebody, how do we want to move forward? What's our next steps on this goal? And they're really just telling me things that I want to hear. And it becomes clear that it's not something that they want for themselves because they never take actions towards those goals. They just placate me whenever I ask about them, right? So that's an example of a fawn response. People have a hard time saying no when they use a fawn response, setting boundaries. They're often prioritizing other people's needs over their own. Another example I can think of in like the homelessness setting is maybe people were living in community when they were unhoused. One person becomes housed and they have a hard time saying no to letting everybody else live in the apartment with them, right? And so often they'll get in trouble because they're violating their lease, and they're just like placating other people who now know where they live. They know what they're about. Maybe they've got the key to the apartment now, and they can't keep them out. Finally, and I apologize for going on kind of long here, but the flop response that we sometimes see. And so this is really, it's a bit of a dissociative response, and it's pretty extreme, where a person feels really kind of completely overwhelmed by a traumatic situation or being triggered and reminding them of a previous traumatic situation. And so it's like a psychological and physical shutdown. We'll see people behave with a sense of numbness, disorientation, or they might even faint, like physically, in the face of overwhelming circumstances. And it's that is the coping strategy to cope with something that is unbearable to them, right? So that's the flop response, a little different than the freeze response. I would say if I had to categorize it, it's much more on like the, yeah, I think it would seem more like something that was like diagnosable to you at first glance, right? Like they're totally dissociative. They're not responding in the way that you expect, almost on the level of like panic disorder kind of stuff. So that's what we have previously called fight or flight response. We're calling it acute stress response, and it has a bunch of different ways that it can show up. It could, one person could have multiple ways that they respond to different traumas in their lives. So it's not like, oh, I'm a fight person and I always fight every time I'm triggered. It's very situation specific. It's very context dependent. And we want you to be able to recognize these as you see them for what they are.
Can I add something here, Ryan, before I go on?
Yeah, please. Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important to listen to note that Ryan never in this slide said trauma response, right? And I think that that's an important piece here, right? Because um, we can experience triggers as a result of previous trauma, right? But these are fear responses, right? These are things that I might even call them survival responses. These are things that have kept us alive. We've learned how to do them. We've learned that we have needs met by doing these things sometime or some sort of like relief, right? Um, and we all like have these things, but these are not bad. They're how like we've individually learned to kind of survive and navigate things like fear and stress.
Yeah, great point. And we can see them start to take over when it's like the only thing that we ever do. But I think what Khalil is saying is there's not like a value judgment with this piece, right? A flight response, a fight response, a flight. All of these things are like quote unquote normal. We all do them all the time. They're stress responses.
Yeah. Oh, and one more thing, just I think one of the ways we can like take that information and translate it into something that feels like trauma-informed care is if anybody does like any diagnosis stuff, or even if you have opinions about specific diagnoses, women who are diagnosed with BPD, borderline personality disorder, might fawn, right, more than other people. And we might call this flirtatious, right? This might make its way into our notes. This might make its way into like our conversations with our colleagues. But now we have some new language here, right? That might actually be a symptom and could be fawning instead of being flirty or like over sexual or however we might name that in our notes. Now you have some new language there, which I think is really cool and actionable.
I love that, Khalil. I know we're like keep just going back and forth on this one, but I love the reframe of that because if we in our notes indicate such and such was so flirty and it's inappropriate sexuality in this environment, yada yada yada, then we kind of stop there, or we focus our excuse me for the Philadelphia. We may stop there with our kind of treatment approach, or we may focus on maybe what I would consider the wrong thing. How do I reduce this person's inappropriate sexuality expressions, right? When the reality is, if we can reframe and understand that as a fawn response, then the next step of that has to be, well, what are they responding to? What stressor or trigger are they responding to? And maybe there's some room for me to change my approach to reduce the level of stress or to offer new coping strategies that might be supportive of them reducing their hyperarousal, right? So it totally changes the nature of how we're going to approach a client when we can appropriately categorize these things as normative stress responses. Want to offer you just as a long list. I sometimes hate presenting like long lists of stuff because I don't know how useful it is. But perhaps when you get a copy of the slides, you can look at this even more closely, and maybe it will draw to mind some behaviors that you've seen in your clients, participants, residents. I've kind of categorized them as like upper versus downer type responses or symptoms, or like aroused ones versus more kind of depressed ones. So we've got things like agitation and anxiety. This one might be familiar to you: extreme startle reflex, where anytime somebody comes around the corner or makes a statement or their voice is raised, you've got another person who's just like totally put on edge by that, right? Um, Anger, rage, and mood swings. We've got even some like medically oriented ones. Racing pulse and high blood pressure might be indicative or a symptom of some trauma. Let's see. I don't want to read all of them. Flashbacks, of course, we might be familiar, and Carlo's going to talk a little bit more about flashbacks or post-traumatic stress in a little bit. But insomnia, night terrors, and other sleep disorders. So frequently when I worked in a mental health clinic and I was working alongside a psychiatrist, one of the kind of most common asks in that setting in community behavioral health was something to help me sleep. Always asking the doc for a sleep medication in addition to whatever there, I'm on a mood stabilizer, or I'm an antidepressant, or I'm on an antipsychotic drug, and also can you give me something to help me sleep? And to me, given that setting and what I knew about it, I think that's just quite indicative of like a latent level of trauma that's existing for many of those folks that we were serving. On the right side of the screen, we've got things like exhaustion or persistent fatigue, sadness and depression, of course, social withdrawal, feeling numb or disconnected, that dissociation that we talked about with the flop response. Um, and then this one is so interesting to me. It's true for clients as well, but my partner is a therapist who focuses on trauma, and my partner says, so my partner has some chronic health stuff, right? And as their practice has progressed, has come to an understanding that there is a relationship between the vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress that they experience in their work and their chronic health conditions. Now, no doctor probably could like make that diagnosis in that way or draw that line, but through kind of self-reflection, they've come to this understanding. And so I think it's fascinating to think about, and I would love to see a study on the levels of chronic health conditions in helpers and also in people in like our behavioral health system, because I bet they're much higher than like the population as a whole, which would speak to this trauma connection, I think. Okay, so those are some of the symptoms and responses. I want to say just because you see any one of these things doesn't necessarily mean you're seeing evidence of trauma. Like, aha, you have high blood pressure, you must be traumatized, right? Any of us could experience any of these signs and symptoms, but I do think that there is a constellation that starts to get painted when we see a number of these, or when we can see, oh, you've got high blood pressure and you told me this story during our intake, and I wonder if there's a connection, right? So it's just more clues in terms of recognition that we can do in trauma informed care, but it's not like a because this then this.
So, we've talked about kind of like the pervasiveness of trauma, right? A lot of us maybe have some trauma history or trauma in our lives, and most, if not all, of the clients we work with do. But we think it's also important to know that most, and Ryan started talking a little bit about resilience, but your body and your brain um, already know what to do to move through most traumatic experiences, right? And again, this depends on like where your brain is and your brain development, but a majority of folks will actually recover from traumatic experiences without developing like a formal diagnosis like PTSD or PTSD symptoms. Some of those symptoms and responses that Ryan shared on the previous slide are going to be just make sense for um, makes sense for experiencing trauma on the front end. First couple weeks might feel like this, might be experiencing these things. Over time, most people have the ability, or most people's brains and bodies have the ability to be okay or recover from that, right? Um, Reminders of past trauma won't be as limiting as they initially were. So again, that speaks to like just naturally over time, things kind of subsiding. But it doesn't mean they go away. We deal with trauma for the rest of our lives. We remember the things that have happened to us, but our ability to cope with and manage it, hopefully over time, is what is kind of being bolstered. Now, if we hold on to those symptoms, if we're having flashbacks and nightmares and these sort of like breakdowns and feeling overly agitated as a result of this event for an extended period of time, for PTSD, that's 30 days, then we start talking about maybe some other things like a diagnosis like PTSD. Um, so this is a mental health diagnosis caused by exposure to trauma. These are typically the single isolated incidents for trauma, right? Whether that is sexual assault, physical violence, maybe a house fire, a car accident. Um, we hear a lot about veterans with PTSD diagnoses, right? And is actually where a lot of like the formula for this diagnosis comes from. But severe and long-lasting disturbances or symptoms are what are going to be the markers of PTSD, right? These symptoms and my reaction to this trauma is stuck here. It's not moving. It's not going anywhere. Maybe I'm becoming very avoidant of specific situations or events that remind me of this thing. And that might actually be PTSD, right? But I don't share this, say like there is no hope, right? Because PTSD is very treatable. We have it sounds like your agency, or at least some of them, or one of them, um, is giving folks EMDR training, right? A very effective intervention for PTSD. Um, I'm trained in prolonged exposure therapy, which I call it like EMDR light, but it's not light. It just, I feel like it has a big PR problem and not as many bells and whistles as like EMDR, but still a very effective treatment, right? And when I tell folk considering PTSD treatment, is for both of these modalities, EMDR or prolonged exposure therapy, is like it can feel scary at first when you're telling your story or retelling your story or making contact and confronting these things for the first time, maybe in a long time, maybe in years or decades, right? But nobody ever gets worse. Some people don't get better when they engage in these treatments, right? But that margin is small. Something like the 80th percentile of folks who engage in EMDR and prolonged exposure therapy um, report like pretty significant improvements in their PTSD symptoms. Um, so I think that's important to know. And I can think of a metaphor that I think also helps us to really understand the difference between trauma and then trauma that needs a little more addressing because it might be limiting our lives in pretty significant ways. So if you work in homelessness services or specifically with folks using substances or maybe they use intravenously, it's pretty likely that you might have worked with folks with some pretty gnarly wounds, right? Maybe they engage in wound care sometimes, maybe they don't, but for for folks who don't have an addiction or are not using substances or are not using intravenously, we might get a cut on our. I have a cut right here actually from my cat this week. This is going to heal on its own over time. I can see it, I can think about it. It might sting sometimes, but it's going to eventually heal. There might be a scar there, may be able to see it from time to time, right? But for our folks who have these wounds that are opening and only growing and maybe become infected, those wounds might need more treatment, right? Might need additional intervention. They might be referred to a wound care nurse or need to go to a hospital. Or I think worst case scenario, that might result in like an amputation. I think we've seen that as well many times in the work that we do. But we can understand trauma and PTSD in the same way. I have a cut or I'm harmed in some way, I should be all right. This will go away over time. If that cut begins to fester and look infected and smell really gross and nasty, we might need some additional intervention, right? So that's how I like to understand trauma and PTSD. There are other trauma diagnoses, not just PTSD. Acute stress disorder is what someone might be diagnosed with before PTSD if they don't quite hit like the time frame, but symptoms look pretty similar. And there are some other things in there as well. But um, these are pretty major, and I think we see them a lot in our spaces. All right, vicarious trauma. I talked a little bit about this, but I think maybe for the context of this specific training, our training time today and what time is left, is I think it's important to understand the difference between vicarious trauma and secondary trauma. Secondary trauma might be some of what Ryan was sharing about their partner experiencing these things after specific sessions or maybe specific clients in their therapy space, and the symptoms they experience, right? If I feel impacted by this in a way where I feel like I'm experiencing this or I can't manage this or it's feeling really hard, that might be a sign of secondary trauma, or secondary traumatic stress. Now, when we start to be like Ebenezer Scrooge and we are just like very just kind of miserable and irritated in our workplaces, in our work roles, that represents a shift in our inner experience, right? It changes our worldview a little bit, probably impacts our empathy. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about vicarious trauma. My ability to care or to be empathetic with my clients and the folks that I serve is changing, and I might need to do something to address that. So that is what we call vicarious trauma. And I think it's sometimes called some other things as well, right? It might sound like countertransference, burnout, compassion fatigue. But again, we have a whole training on this coming in May. So yeah, 3 months, we'll talk more about vicarious trauma.
Yeah, there's the date on the screen if you're interested in this. I do want to say that I believe the signups for this series might be based on like training topics, so I'm not 100% sure on that, but keep your eyes peeled with the Coalition for the Homeless for like the future topics and dates and registration. Oh, there's Laura popping up. Do you want to add to that, Laura?
Yeah, we will send out the registration links as we get closer to specific days and dates. So everybody watch your emails. If you don't get an email or somehow you miss it, just reach out to me and I can get that to you, or you can go to the coalition's website and sign up there.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. Alrighty. We're moving on to the next R here, and we're starting to get into the kind of the real, I don't want to use a meat reference. I was going to say the meat and potatoes, maybe the tofu and potatoes of trauma-informed care, right? So we've done a lot of work already around realizing the impact of trauma, being able to recognize its symptoms and the types of responses that people might have to trauma. And now we need to integrate that knowledge and respond to that trauma, right? By implementing trauma-informed care. So I want to talk a little bit about what that can look like. And what we mean by respond is that an agency's policies and its procedures and its actions should be calibrated to trauma-informed care best practices. And so I'm just reiterating that trauma-informed care is not just for the direct service professional or the case manager or the service coordinator to implement, although it happens there too. It also should be implemented at a more structural agency organizational supervision level, right? So we need to be taking all of this information that we've already talked about and trying to find ways to respond to that information. Okay, so if 100% of the people that are going to walk through our doors have experienced trauma, our space and our staff training and all of our procedures should speak to that or be responsive to that. So that might include a change in our language, the language that we use. And we heard some examples of this in the chat already. People talk about being person first. And so using person first language would be a small and easy and impactful way that we can start to tease the edges of trauma-informed care, right? Using person first language, it means exactly what it sounds like. We're speaking about the person first, as opposed to speaking about them through the language of a disorder or a diagnosis, right? That schizophrenic person, that homeless person. Well, it's a person who may be dealing with schizophrenia or maybe dealing with hallucinations. They're a person who is currently unhoused and they've been in our program for X length of time, right? It's person first language. And that language and that culture should be supportive of this idea of resilience that we talked about. You can, your cut will heal. And we're here to support you while it does, right? And it should be coming from a place of a belief in the inherent possibility of healing and recovery for every person that we serve. I think this gets harder to maintain that belief the longer somebody is in our program without us seeing visible signs of change. And also the longer that we are in the field or in our roles, right? It gets harder to believe that everybody has the possibility for healing and growth and change. And yet, if we're not promoting that culture and that belief, we may not be tapping all the way into trauma-informed care. The other thing that we're going to want to do in our response is to commit really solidly to safe environments. And I'm speaking, as Carlo was speaking to earlier, about the physical environment as well as the psychological or emotional environment. So, here a couple quick examples, and we're going to dive into this more in our second session about how do we respond. But keeping parking lots and common areas and bathrooms and entrances and exits well lit could be an example of keeping the physical environment safe, right? If you've ever walked in a place that doesn't feel safe and the lights are like flickering or off, that's pretty triggering, even despite any potential traumas that we have, right? So things like that. We're using the physical environment as an intervention. And it's why we focus so much on, like, if you've ever been to like a private practice therapist's office, they're always so good about this. It's like having a really nice rug and excellent lighting, and maybe it smells a little bit like eucalyptus and lavender. I think that's trauma-informed care. Yes, they're trying to kind of demonstrate that they're like a reputable therapist, but also they're setting me at ease when I walk into that waiting room. I think there's a lot to learn from that, even in the kind of nonprofit social service, less well-funded environments, right? And then I mentioned the kind of psychological or the social emotional environment. Things like keeping consistent schedules and procedures, right? Predictable consistency is trauma-informed care. The more things feel chaotic in an environment, the less safe they feel emotionally, right? I'm not going to get my needs met, or I'm going to get swept under the rug, or they're going to forget about me, or they're going to think I'm doing something I wasn't supposed to, right? So the level of consistency and trust building that's possible through that consistency is trauma-informed care. Culture and practices that are supportive of connection. Connection, broadly, is going to be one of the critical ways that we support people who have experienced trauma, right? A sense of connectedness to a greater sense of meaning and purpose and a community is going to be an incredibly protective factor in coping with trauma. And so any way that we can support that connection is going to be useful. And I say that for both staff and participant clients. So things like at our former place of work, we used to talk about this in the context of like community inclusion, but things like a garden club, things like restaurant club, where people go out to eat together for no other purpose but to like share camaraderie and space. That is supportive of connection. And I think we can look at activities like that and say, well, yeah, but where's the treatment? And I want to say that that is the treatment, right? The supporting of the connection is a way that people are going to be able to cope with trauma, respond differently to trauma, learn new techniques and coping strategies, and then be able to work on all the other stuff that they want to work on in terms of their housing journey or their mental health, right? It's why things like staff parties and get-togethers and happy hours are so critical, actually, to people's experience of vicarious trauma, is because it's supportive of connection. Last thing I want to say here on this slide is evidence-based trauma practices should be a part of the way we respond. And so we've named some of them already. Carlo mentioned that he's trained in prolonged exposure. This is one evidence-based practice. We've also got EMDR that was mentioned, which is eye movement and eye movement and desensitization. EMDR, eye movement desensitization response. Reprocessing. Yes, you're like teaching the brain how to process things differently, right? We've also got examples of CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy that are like trauma focused. So TF-CBT is an online set of modules that a therapist could go through and is an evidence-based practice. And then I want to talk about this more next session, but I want to, if you're not familiar with the concept of seeking safety, It's an evidence-based practice that is specifically aimed to people who are experiencing PTSD or the after effects of trauma and substance use disorder, which for us captures quite a large segment of our homelessness population, right? Or our recently housed population. The reason I want to emphasize seeking safety is that it's evidence-based, but it can be done by anybody, right? It's not just only for therapists, quote unquote, or licensed professionals. It can be done with anybody and by anybody, and yet it's evidence-based, right? And so we'll talk more about this one next session, but I wanted to throw it at you as a concept. You can look it up if you're not familiar. Laura, did you want to? I see you popped up again. Did you want to make a comment or say anything here?
You're muted, Laura.
Oh, you're muted, Laura. Sorry.
Want to make sure that you are ready to wrap up, and just a couple of closing comments here.
Yep.
This has been excellent information, and I hope everybody is starting to process this themselves and starting to think about along these lines, and we'll be ready for the next one next week. And then remind everybody also that you will have two surveys, evaluations to fill out, one for HeartSet and one for the coalition. And you are going to put your information in the chat if you haven't already done that. Have you done that, friends? Okay.
Nope, not yet. We're going to do that now.
We'll do that. And then I also want to invite everybody to Bagels in the Basement. That's in person Friday from 9 to 10:30 here at the Coalition. It's resource sharing, networking. You get coffee and bagels. Just show up. If you haven't signed up, that's fine. Just show up and come prepared to talk about what you're doing at your organization, any updates, changes, new programs, events you want to share. It's a very laid back, low key event. So I hope you all will come to that. And I really, really hope you all will come to the next community table with our friends Khalil and Ryan.
Thank you so much, Laura. We appreciate it. We've appreciated being here. Let me just flash on the screen a couple of slides and give you our links to our materials, and then we'll get on out of here. Just showing you that the next R was resist traumatization, and you can look at the slides for more info there. Then repair was our final R, and we dig in on that a little bit. And I want to hit you with these next steps. So we're going to ask that folks complete our evaluation, as Laura mentioned, as well as the coalition's evaluation, and I'm dropping the link now. Here is our evaluation. And if you complete that evaluation, you'll be giving us your email, and we will follow up with a copy of our slides. You'll get a certificate of attendance. You'll get some other like tip sheet material. And then I want to suggest another next step. We have a TIC-Talk supplemental material that we're going to send you. I want to suggest that folks print that out and just begin to evaluate the ways that your program is currently actualizing what we've talked about so far in trauma-informed care, just as a kind of mental exercise for yourself. So that's all that we have for you today. We want to thank you all again for letting us talk with you and being a part of this session, this community event. And we hope to see you next week, same time next Wednesday.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.